On the morning of January 29th, 1951, an 18-year-old film star walked into a Los Angeles courtroom to dissolve a marriage barely 7 months old. Elizabeth Taylor came to divorce a man carrying one of the most famous surnames in America, Hilton. Reporters crowding the corridor already knew the story they intended to write, a tale of two wealthy, restless young people who rushed into a wedding and tired of one another just as quickly. For over half a century, that version held. Yet, does the collapse of this marriage really come down to mutual immaturity? Or did the press of 1951 bury something far darker? And why did the full account only surface in a set of audio tapes released more than 70 years after the wedding day? The Macambo nightclub on the Sunset Strip pulled in almost every famous face of post-war Hollywood, and one evening in October 1949, it pulled together two people whose wedding would soon fill American front pages. Elizabeth Taylor, then 17, grew up inside the machinery of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, a studio that supervised her schooling, her friendships, and her photographs from her earliest childhood years. Conrad Nicholson Hilton Jr., known to everyone simply as Nicky, walked in as the eldest son of Conrad Hilton Sr., the hotelier whose surname already hung above buildings across the country. Her celebrity came from a decade of paid work in front of studio cameras, accumulated film by film since childhood. His arrived as an inheritance. Nightclubs, like the Mocambo, did double duty in that world. Ostensibly places of leisure, they operated in practice as stages where studios displayed their stars and columnists gathered the raw material for the next morning's papers, which meant that a meeting there carried no real privacy. Whatever passed between Taylor and Nicky at that first encounter, an audience of professionals watched it happen. Romance in Hollywood began in public because publicity drove the entire ritual. By 1949, Taylor counted a full decade as studio property in everything but the legal sense. Contract players of her generation lived under morality clauses and publicity departments that decided which restaurants they visited and which young men collected them at the door. A childhood passed on sound stages left her famous and closely watched, yet it also left her with almost no experience of ordinary life beyond the studio gates. Marriage to a girl raised that way could look like the only available exit. Their courtship unfolded in public from the very first week. Gossip columnists trailed the couple through restaurants and premieres, and the sight of the screen's most photographed teenager on the arm of a hotel heir proved irresistible to editors from coast to coast. An engagement followed within months. By the spring of 1950, a wedding date stood fixed on the calendar, chosen, as we shall soon see, with far more calculation than romance. Nothing about the pairing troubled the columnists who chronicled it. A gap of 6 years between a 17-year-old and a young man of 23 fell comfortably inside the conventions of the day, and the match, by all appearances, carried both families' blessing. The public read about flowers and dinner reservations. Questions about the character of the man himself, the sort any parent might quietly ask, never reached print, and no evidence suggests that anyone at MGM asked them either. The fortune waiting behind Nicky's name grew from a single Texas hotel into an international chain, and by the middle of the century, the Hiltons ranked among the wealthiest families in America. Money on that scale bought more than comfort. It bought a certain kind of protection, the sort that shapes how newspapers write about a man, and the same protection would keep his conduct out of print for decades. About Nicky himself, the record preserves troubling outlines. A young man with a taste for nightclubs and a dependence on alcohol that, as later events would prove beyond doubt, would one day kill him. To make sense of what came next, it helps to understand how a Hollywood studio of 1950 treated its most bankable names. Under the contract system, MGM did not merely employ Elizabeth Taylor. The company managed nearly every visible corner of her existence, from the roles she accepted to the gowns she wore in public. Publicity men planted stories and buried inconvenient episodes as a matter of daily routine. A star's private life belonged in practice to the product line. Taylor's own consent to any of this counted for little, and asking about it would have struck her employers as an odd question. Still a legal minor when the studio began shaping her image, she remained barely an adult when it staged her wedding. Contracts of the period gave performers little practical power to refuse, and a teenage girl dependent on MGM for her income and her career held less than most. The machine decided, and its verdict called for a wedding that sold tickets. In 1950, Taylor's newest picture happened to be Father of the Bride, a comedy in which she played a young woman preparing for her wedding day. The film would reach cinemas that summer. Somewhere inside MGM, an obvious calculation followed. If the studio's real teenage star married a real millionaire's son just as the picture arrived, no advertising campaign on earth could compete with the coverage. The wedding date landed on May 6, 1950, timed against the film's release, and the ceremony became, in effect, a promotional event with a marriage attached. Father of the Bride reached audiences soon afterwards, and for months every new photograph of the real bride doubled as free advertising for the fictional one the studio put on screen. Commercially, MGM judged the situation perfectly, and in human terms its judgment barely existed. Nobody in the marketing chain appears to have asked whether the groom suited the marriage itself. That question waited for the honeymoon. MGM financed the wedding gown outright and handed the commission to Helen Rose, the studio's own costume designer, whose work Taylor knew well from the sound stages. Rose produced a dress built to photograph beautifully, paid for by a film company with a picture to sell. Even the bridal party carried the studio's fingerprints, filled out with MGM contract players such as the actress and singer Jane Powell. Almost nothing about the day belonged to the bride alone. None of this depends on rumor or reconstruction, since studio archives and later accounts describe the arrangements plainly, down to who paid for the dress. An irony sits inside those files that nobody at the time seems to have examined. On screen, Taylor played a bride whose devoted father worries over every detail of her happiness, while off-screen the 18-year-old walked toward a groom whose character no one at the studio appears to have investigated at all. The fictional wedding received more care than the real one. The wedding took place in Los Angeles on May 6, 1950, before a city that treated it as the social occasion of the season. Afterwards, Conrad Hilton Sr. paid for a reception at the Bel Air Country Club on a scale few private families could have contemplated. 700 guests attended. Through the crowd moved some of the most famous performers alive, Gene Kelly, Ginger Rogers, and Fred Astaire among them, and their presence confirmed that Hollywood turned out in force for one of its own. For Conrad Sr., the reception amounted to more than a father's generosity. A family that built its fortune on hospitality now hosted the most watched party in America, and every column, inch describing the champagne in the guest list polished the Hilton name as surely as any advertisement. Commerce ran through both sides of this wedding. The bride sold a film, and the groom's family sold a brand of luxury. For ordinary Americans, the wedding played as a piece of national theater. A country still settling into post-war prosperity read the coverage the way it watched Taylor's films, as a glimpse of a charmed life admired from a distance. The bride they cheered remained, to most of them, indistinguishable from the character she played on screen that same season. That confusion between the role and the person suited the studio perfectly, and it would soon make the collapse of the marriage far harder for the public to interpret honestly. One detail from that day deserves correction because print has repeated it wrongly for decades. Historical accounts routinely describe the groom as 24 years old at the altar. The calendar says otherwise. Born on July 6, 1926, Nicky stood 2 months short of his 24th birthday, leaving him 23 when he married the 18-year-old Taylor. A small error, admittedly, yet it shows how casually inaccuracies attach themselves to famous lives and how rarely anyone bothers to check. Setting the record straight, even on minor points, matters in a story whose major points bent so badly. Newspapers wrote up the event in the language of a fairy tale, and by the standards of what the public then knew, the language fitted. A beautiful young star married a handsome heir with the blessing of two of the most powerful institutions in California, a film studio and a hotel dynasty. No reporter outside the reception could have guessed how quickly the fairy tale would rot, or how long the rot would stay hidden from view. The honeymoon began almost at once. The newlyweds left for an extended honeymoon in Europe, the sort of grand tour that only money on the Hilton scale could sustain. Press coverage from those months contained nothing but glamour. Photographs showed a teenage film star and her wealthy husband moving through the great cities of the continent, smiling for cameras that waited outside every hotel. Whatever unfolded behind the doors of those hotels never reached a single newspaper, and it would keep for more than 70 years. The silence around the trip owed something to distance and everything to structure. Foreign correspondents photographed arrivals and departures rather than marriages. Hotel staff in the grand establishments of Europe earned part of their wages through discretion. And no editor in 1950 employed reporters to investigate the private conduct of a honeymooning husband. A story of this kind could travel quite literally nowhere because the machinery for hearing it did not yet exist. In public, in 1951, Taylor would speak only of cruelty in its mental form, a phrase we will return to shortly. In private, years later, she ventured much further. During the 1960s, she sat for a series of recorded conversations with the journalist Richard Merriman, tapes that stayed out of public reach until a documentary released in 2024, Elizabeth Taylor, The Lost Tapes, finally played them aloud. On those recordings, in her own voice, Taylor stated plainly that Nicky physically abused her during the European honeymoon. Alcohol runs through every account of that trip, and indeed through every account of Nicky's adult life. His dependence on drink is one of the few points on which all sources agree, and it would eventually contribute to his death at an unusually early age. By Taylor's later telling, the drinking dominated the honeymoon and fed a temper that turned violent behind closed doors. A bride of 18, thousands of miles from home, absorbed the consequences alone. Later biographical accounts add a further claim that heroin as well as alcohol fueled his volatility. Honesty demands a caveat here. No contemporaneous evidence confirms that Nicky used heroin during the honeymoon of 1950, and the allegation rests on accounts assembled long after the events they describe. His alcoholism, by contrast, sits in the record beyond any argument. A careful telling of this story keeps those two claims in separate boxes, one verified and one not. One further allegation attaches to this marriage, the gravest of the entire story, and it demands more care than anything else in this account. For that reason, it belongs later in the narrative, alongside the tapes that carry it, where the strength and the limits of the evidence can be weighed properly. For now, only a simpler statement carries full confidence. The marriage that 700 guests toasted in May began falling apart before the year ended. Back in California, the couple settled into married life or into something wearing its costume. The behavior Taylor would later describe under oath, the rages and the cold indifference, rendered a shared home unbearable within a few months of the toasts at the Bel Air Country Club. Appearances held for a while, since appearances remained the family business on both sides of this marriage. Behind them, by the end of autumn, very little remained. In December 1950, 7 months after the wedding day that MGM engineered so carefully, Taylor physically separated from her husband and moved out of their shared home. Writers would later fix the span of the marriage at 205 days, a figure repeated ever since with a kind of grim fascination. 205 days, by that count, separated the toasts of 700 guests from the end of everything they celebrated. She never returned. Numbers like 205 flatten what they measure. Inside that span sat a wedding staged for cameras and a honeymoon Taylor would one day describe as violent, followed by a return to a household governed by a temper she would soon detail under oath. Each day of it belonged to a girl of 18 with no adult experience of the world beyond a film studio. The figure survives as trivia, while what it contained took decades to surface. For Taylor, walking out carried real risk. Divorce still trailed a heavy social stigma in 1950, and an 18-year-old whose public image rested on wholesome young womanhood stood to lose more from it than almost anyone. The studio that staged her wedding as a promotional triumph now faced the collapse of its own production, and MGM's publicity machine turned, as it always did, toward damage control. Nobody intended to leave the shape of the resulting story to chance. The end arrived formally on January 29, 1951, in a Los Angeles courtroom. A judge granted Taylor a divorce on the legal grounds of mental cruelty, and the marriage that an entire studio apparatus built dissolved in a single brief hearing. She stood before the judge, still 18 years old, her 19th birthday almost a month away. A word about that phrase, mental cruelty, is worth pausing on. American divorce law at mid-century operated on fault, which meant a spouse who wanted out needed to prove misconduct before a judge would end the marriage. Mental cruelty worked as the era's workhorse category, elastic enough to cover everything from constant quarreling to sustained terror, and it allowed a petitioner to satisfy the law without airing the worst of what occurred. The phrase, in other words, could conceal at least as much as it revealed. Keep that elasticity in mind when her testimony arrives. Under oath, Taylor told the court what living with Nikki involved. She testified that her husband possessed an uncontrollable temper, that he used abusive language toward her, and that he treated her with indifference. Sworn testimony of this kind, delivered in open court by a witness risking her career to give it, carries a weight that gossip never can, whatever discount later writers chose to apply. Every word entered the public record in January 1951, available to any reporter who cared to read it. Then came the moment that revealed her character more clearly than any studio biography ever could. Given the chance to claim alimony from one of the largest fortunes in the United States, Taylor refused it outright, reportedly telling the court, "I don't need a prize for failing." An 18-year-old walked away from Hilton money with nothing but her own earnings. Whatever the press would soon write about her immaturity, the girl in that courtroom behaved like the only adult in the marriage. Money refused can say more than money taken. A settlement drawn from the Hilton fortune could have supported her comfortably for the rest of her life, and accepting one would have cost her nothing but a single signature. Turning it down told the court, and anyone paying attention, that she wanted no continuing bond with the family, not even a financial one. The press, paying such close attention to her supposed childishness, somehow missed the meaning of that gesture entirely. What her testimony did not contain matters just as much. Nothing in the 1951 record describes physical violence, and we cannot know for certain why the darker dimension stayed out of court. The pressures on her are not difficult to imagine. From a studio guarding its investment to a society that treated a husband's fists as a private domestic matter, yet imagination is not evidence, and the honest position is that her reasons remain unrecorded. The full account would wait decades for a pair of unlikely messengers, a journalist's tape recorder and a second Mrs. Hilton. With the divorce granted, the press faced a choice about explaining it. The sworn testimony sat in the public file, plain and available, yet almost no one chose to build the story around it. Instead, coverage of the era largely protected Nikki Hilton and located the failure of the marriage in Elizabeth Taylor's youth, a framing that would prove astonishingly durable. The clearest specimen appeared in Cosmopolitan in February 1951, within days of the decree. That magazine framed the split as the predictable symptom of a former child star struggling to adapt to adult life, a young woman raised on sound stages who simply could not manage a real marriage. Nikki's conduct received no meaningful scrutiny at all. A man described under oath weeks earlier as possessing an uncontrollable temper emerged from the article untouched, while the teenager who testified against him became a case study in failure. Consider the timing of that piece, because timing tells its own story. Taylor's testimony entered the record only days earlier, fresh and easy to check, yet the magazine chose psychology over evidence and diagnosed the teenager rather than examining the man. Editorial choices of that kind rarely announce themselves as choices. To readers in February 1951, the article read as neutral common sense, which is exactly how a protective myth takes root. To modernize, the imbalance looks perverse, but it grew from the ordinary assumptions of its time. Domestic violence in 1951 rarely appeared in print under its own name, since newspapers and magazines treated whatever happened inside a marriage as private territory, and wealthy men enjoyed a further layer of deference that money has always purchased. A film studio with an interest in tidy narratives pressed in the same direction. Between those forces, an inconvenient court record never stood a chance. Print has a way of laundering guesses into facts. Once the child star explanation appeared in a national magazine, later writers repeated it, then cited one another repeating it, until the framing acquired the texture of established history. Nobody needed to lie for this to happen. Ordinary journalistic laziness compounded over decades can bury a court record as effectively as any conspiracy. Out of that coverage grew the account that would harden into accepted history: two spoiled, wealthy young people who married in haste and failed together. The framing held the advantage of blaming no one in particular, which suited nearly everyone except the person who actually suffered. It survived Taylor's own lifetime almost intact. Dismantling it requires evidence from an unexpected quarter, and that evidence arrived more than a decade after the divorce, through the second woman who chose to marry Nicky Hilton. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching this video on Elizabeth Taylor and Nicky Hilton. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of their story down below in the comments. And if you have any suggestions for future videos, also let me know down below in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, let's continue. In the years that followed the divorce, Nicky married again, this time to a woman named Patricia McClintock, a figure far less famous than her predecessor and one who left a much slimmer public trail. What she did leave sits in legal archives, and it speaks with unusual force. Court filings, unlike memoirs, are sworn documents with consequences attached for anyone who lies in them. In 1964, McClintock sued her husband for divorce, citing extreme mental and physical suffering at his hands. 3 years later, in 1967, she returned to court, and this time the language sharpened further, accusing Nicky explicitly of repeated acts and threats of violence. Read those phrases slowly. A second wife, more than a decade after Taylor's testimony, described the same man in strikingly similar terms, under oath, with lawyers and judges listening. Corroboration of this kind changes how earlier evidence reads. Standing alone, Taylor's 1951 testimony invited dismissal as the exaggeration of a teenager in a divorce court, and for decades the dismissal came easily. Set beside McClintock's filings, it becomes one half of a pattern: two women, 13 and 16 years apart, swearing to the same temper and the same violence. Patterns of that sort are precisely what historians look for when a single account cannot be checked on its own. A woman in McClintock's position possessed almost no venue apart from a divorce court in which to say such things at all. Police in that era rarely intervened in what they classed as marital disputes, and no shelters and no support networks existed anywhere in the country to receive her. The courtroom remained the only room where her account carried legal force. That her sworn words survive at all is largely an accident of procedure, preserved because ending the marriage required writing them down. Why the McClintock filings changed nothing at the time is a question worth sitting with. Divorce papers rarely make national news unless a star's name sits on them, and by the 1960s, Nicky Hilton faded into the supporting cast of other people's stories. His filings gathered dust in county archives while the myth about his first marriage circulated freely. Evidence only works when somebody reads it. Nicky Hilton's final years followed the trajectory his drinking long promised. The alcoholism that sources describe as severe and lifelong deepened rather than lifted, and no fortune on earth could purchase an exemption from its slow arithmetic. In 1969, he suffered a heart attack and died at 42, a death his doctors attributed to the drinking that shadowed him since youth. He outlived his marriage to Taylor by 18 years and never faced a public reckoning of any kind. The newspapers that shielded him in 1951 saw no reason to revisit the subject at his death, and the surname above hotel entrances around the world retained its shine. Somewhere, though, a set of tape recordings already existed. Recorded during the previous decade, they held an account of the honeymoon that no obituary hinted at, and they would sit unheard for more than half a century. There is a bleak symmetry in the timing worth noticing. The man whose conduct the institutions of 1951 concealed died just as the culture protecting him started to loosen, shortly before American divorce law began abandoning fault altogether and long before anyone printed the words describing what he did. He never answered a single public question about either marriage, and the silence he purchased early held to the end. During the 1960s, Elizabeth Taylor sat down with the journalist Richard Merriman and let a tape recorder run. Across those sessions, she spoke with a candor she never permitted herself in print, working back and forth through the events of her life while the reels quietly captured everything. Her first marriage figured among the subjects she addressed. What she recorded about Nicky Hilton reached far beyond anything the 1951 court file contained. Taylor died in 2011 with the recordings still private. They surfaced at last in 2024, when the documentary Elizabeth Taylor, The Lost Tapes built its account of her life around her own recorded voice. Audiences heard the star of the 1950s speaking from beyond the grave, and among the revelations, one landed with particular weight. On the tapes, Taylor confessed explicitly that Nicky physically abused her during their European honeymoon, the first time the public ever received that fact in her own words. Testimony released after death occupies awkward ground, and honest history acknowledges the awkwardness. A speaker who can no longer be questioned cannot clarify her words or answer challenge, which is precisely why historians treat such recordings with care rather than credulity. Two things nonetheless distinguish the Taylor tapes from ordinary posthumous score settling. She recorded them decades before her death, long before any documentary existed to shape them, and what she described matches sworn court documents filed by a second wife she is not known to have ever consulted. Why Taylor recorded the sessions in the first place and why she never released them herself are questions the record leaves open. Perhaps the conversations amounted to groundwork for a memoir, perhaps to a private reckoning, but any answer would be a guess, and this account will not dress guesses as facts. What matters is the material itself. Hours of her voice, fixed on tape in the 1960s, waited out her entire lifetime and then rewrote the history of her first marriage. The tapes also carry the single most horrifying allegation ever attached to this marriage. According to Taylor's recorded account, Nicky flew into a drunken rage and kicked her in the stomach, and as a result of that assault, she suffered a miscarriage. A claim this grave, resting on a single voice, calls for more caution than anything else here. Everything about it must be weighed honestly, both the reasons for believing it and the hard limits of what the evidence can bear. The allegation originates entirely from these posthumously released recordings, which makes it in strict terms a single-source claim. No public medical records from 1950 confirm a miscarriage, and no police report or contemporaneous witness account has ever surfaced. Absence of paperwork proves nothing by itself. Studio cover-ups of that era ran thorough enough that documents of exactly this kind routinely disappeared or never came into existence, which means missing records are precisely what a cover-up would leave behind. Even so, the honest verdict available to us is an uncomfortable one. Many modern historians consider the claim highly plausible, given Nicky's corroborated pattern of violence, yet plausible is not the same as proven, and the allegation must be labeled unverified. Strip the disputed allegation away entirely, and the tapes still upend the story. Physical abuse on the honeymoon, stated in Taylor's own voice, joins sworn testimony from 1951 and sworn filings from 1964 and 1967 to form a record that points in one direction only. A claim that cannot be verified sits alongside a pattern that has been. History often has to live with exactly that kind of unevenness. For over 50 years, the accepted version ran roughly as follows. Two pampered young people, a movie star and an heir, rushed into a glamorous wedding and discovered they could not stand each other. then parted in a spectacle of shared childishness. Blame in that telling spread evenly across both names, and almost every element of it collapses on contact with the documents. Consider what the record actually holds, starting with sworn testimony from 1951 describing an uncontrollable temper and abusive language. Legal filings from a second wife describe extreme physical suffering and repeated threats of violence, and a death in 1969 closes the file on a man destroyed by his own drinking at 42. Nothing comparable exists on the other side of the ledger, since no court document and no credible account accuses Elizabeth Taylor of anything worse than being 18. A both sides story requires two sides. The press of 1951 blamed the former child star for failing to manage adulthood, and the irony of that framing is only sharpened with time. Taylor, at 18, testified truthfully under oath and declined a fortune in alimony, then built one of the most celebrated careers the film industry has ever produced. Her 23-year-old husband drank himself into an early grave. Between the two, the record leaves little doubt about which one failed to grow up. Taylor herself appears rarely to have dwelt on the marriage in public during the long decades that followed, and the reticence on reflection is not hard to understand. 7 further marriages and a career of historic scale gave the press far better material than a 7-month union from 1950. Her silence left the field open. Into that space, the tidy myth of 2 immature kids settled comfortably and stayed. Popular memory shows how this history came to be written. In 2011, Time magazine filed the union under a list of the shortest celebrity marriages ever recorded, a piece of trivia built around the number 205. Nothing about violence appeared in that framing, and nothing required it to, because the myth's work by then spanned 60 years. A court record from January 1951 sat in public that entire time, its contents unchanged year after year, waiting for somebody, anybody, to take it seriously. This story also carries a caution about how celebrity history takes shape in general. The most accessible version of a famous life is rarely the most accurate one, since accessible versions are usually assembled by publicists and repeated by writers on deadline. Court archives move slower than headlines. Anyone willing to read the primary record, in this case a divorce file open to the public since 1951, could have corrected the myth at any point across 7 decades, and for 7 decades almost nobody did. The correction, when it finally arrived, required her voice and her death in equal measure. Taylor's sworn account stayed on public file from January 1951, yet it took until 2024 and a set of tapes played after she could no longer be cross-examined or dismissed for the mutual immaturity story to fall apart. Nicky Hilton spent his short life protected by money and by the habits of a compliant press. Her testimony waited 73 years for readers willing to believe it.